Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Rita Koutsidimos. I'm the Executive Director of the BC Alliance for Healthy Living, and we are so pleased that you are joining us today for our webinar, Movers and Shakers, How Active Transportation Champions Can Change a Community. I'd like to start by acknowledging that this webinar is being broadcast from the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, where we have the privilege to live, work, and play. So we're here today to discuss and be inspired by several active transportation projects happening across our province. Because we know when communities make it more convenient and comfortable for people to walk, bike, roll to where they need to go, they also make it easier for people to be healthier. Investment in active transportation infrastructure has been called a best buy for governments by the World Health Organization, because the evidence shows it's one of the most effective ways to support physical activity rates, which is key to the prevention of chronic disease. Healthy built environments that make the healthy choice the easy choice are contingent on good community planning and political and public support. And this requires community champions behind the scenes to get things started. So we have an excellent program lined up for you today on how active transportation champions can change a community. But first, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you're having trouble hearing, try turning up the volume on your phone or computer. We really want to get your input today. So we'll be asking you to use the control panel on the right-hand corner of your screen. Type in your questions for our speakers as you think of them, and we'll be having a question period after each speaker and a final round at the end of the presentation. We also want you to participate in some polls. We'll give you a heads up that a poll is coming, and you'll see a blue screen that has multiple choice questions. Please respond to the polls. You'll have a few seconds to do so, and then we'll publish the results for everyone to see. The polls provide us, our panelists, and you with instant feedback. Again, we really want to hear your questions and comments. You can submit them at any time during a presentation by simply typing them in the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. Please indicate if there's someone in particular you're addressing it to. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for, and if we miss any of them, we'll send out a post-event email with missed Q's and A's. Now, let me tell you about our program today. I'd like to start by talking about the Provincial Physical Activity Strategy, Active People, Active Places. BC's Physical Activity Strategy, which is led by the Ministry of Health, was designed to guide and stimulate coordinated policies, practices, and programs in physical activity to improve the health and well-being of British Columbians, both for the individual and the communities in which they live, learn, work, and play. Two of the innovative and important programs that we'll hear about today are supported by the Provincial Physical Activity Strategy through an Active Communities grant. And the first presentation we'll hear comes from the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure and profiles some of the exciting work they've been doing lately to develop BC's first ever active transportation strategy. It's very exciting for us to get a sneak peek on this groundbreaking work, especially because BC Alliance for Healthy Living has been advocating for provincial active transportation strategy for 3 years now. And we know that they've been working with colleagues in the Ministry of Health and other ministries, so it's really great to see this cross-ministerial approach in action. We also know that the public cares about this issue. In 2017, we had public opinion polling done that showed 7 in 10 British Columbians said they'd be motivated to walk or bike more often with improved routes, and 75% support dedicated funding for that infrastructure. So after that, we'll hear about 2 fantastic active transportation projects, one urban and one rural, and both recipients of an Active Communities grant from the province's Physical Activity Strategy. Our first speaker, Dean Murdoch from the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, will give an overview of BC's active transportation strategy. Next, Natalie Corbeau from the City of North Vancouver will present on Go CNV, Active Transportation Individualized Marketing Pilot Project. Our last speaker, Dr. Charles Helm, will share some of his breathtaking photos with his presentation on promoting universal access in Tumbler Ridge's UNESCO Global Geopark. We'll hear why these projects are important, how they're working, and lessons learned. So that's an overview of the webinar, but before we introduce our first speaker, we'd like to start with 2 questions about you. We'll put both questions up as polls and post the results. If you see that you fit into more than one category, then just choose the one that's the best fit for why you're joining today. So let's start with which of these statements best describes your interest in the topic of today's webinar. I work in public health, I work in research or policy, in local government, I'm interested in healthy built environments, or I am a champion for active transportation and want to get some more ideas. Okay, so lots of folks from public health, that's great. And then a mix of other folks in research and local government, and some strong interest in built environments too. And then, because we're talking about transportation today, we're just curious about you and what is your primary mode of transportation? Do you walk? Do you roll? Do you cycle? Do you drive? Do you use transit? Most of the time. All right. We've got lots of multimodal users and drivers and walkers, and yeah, that's great. I'm surprised we don't have more transit users, but I guess that's probably the multimodal users as well. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dean Murdoch. Dean Murdoch is the project manager for the province's active transportation strategy. He's a former municipal councillor serving on Saanich Council for 3 terms until 2018, when he decided not to seek re-election. I want to thank you for joining us today, Dean. We're excited to hear you speak about the strategy, and now I'll turn it over to you to start us off.
Thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. I just want to start by acknowledging that I'm in Victoria, where I'm a guest on the traditional territories of the Lekwungen peoples, specifically the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nations. So just want to begin by acknowledging with gratitude that I'm a guest here today. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you. I am really looking forward to hearing from the other 2 presenters. Active transportation is something that is really close to my heart, near and dear. As a former councillor, it was something I championed for in my community, and I am delighted to have the opportunity to lead the development of the province's active transportation strategy. At least lead the project involved in developing. I'm not the only one holding the pen on the strategy, and I'll tell you more about that in just a moment. It was interesting to see the poll results identifying most people on the webinar this morning are multimodal commuters, and that's consistent with our findings as well, that most people don't move around just by a single mode, but really it's multimodal connectivity, which reinforces for us the importance of the network and getting people to and from by the very means that they travel. So we're not just cyclists, we're not just walkers or transit users or drivers. We really are multimodal commuters. And the active transportation strategy is going to hopefully make a contribution in that realm to ensure that people are able to get around more effectively, efficiently, and safely. So let's get into it. If we can go to the first slide, there we are. The active transportation strategy gets a shout out in the province's new Clean BC plan. I'm sure folks on the line are probably familiar with that plan. It's the province's master plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, move us towards renewable energies, and reduce our carbon footprint. The Clean BC plan gives a shout out to the active transportation strategy, and that was really our window to get moving. As Rita pointed out, this is something that many folks have been keen on for a number of years, including folks here at the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure. And so seeing this acknowledged in Clean BC was really an enormous opportunity for us to get going. And it has really taken off. And we're delighted to have something that we'll be able to share very shortly. On the next slide, you'll see that just we are all on the same page about what active transportation is all about. Obviously, most people think of walking and cycling, and those are the primary modes of active transportation, but we're looking at all human forms of travel. That's running, scootering, skateboarding, inline skating, kayaking, canoeing, people who move by using a wheelchair, even seeing people around town on one of those big wheels that they straddle, and I got to tell you, that looks terrifying to me. So looking at all those forms of what they're calling micromobility or emerging mobility, and looking at connections to transit and ferries. So not the actual tram trips or ferry trips, but sort of the first and last mile principle, as I talked about at the intro. Multimodal commuters. Everybody starts as an active transportation commuter, and if it's only for a few steps. Thinking about how everyone gets around. On the next slide, we've identified some of the benefits of active transportation, and there are many. In the first bullet, you'll see an acknowledgement of greenhouse gas emission savings, and that really is the primary thrust, as this is nested within Clean BC. So that reduction measure there or target is if we were able to double mode share of cyclists only. We know the current mode share cyclists, I should say, and if we were able to double it, those are the savings we're able to achieve. We know that through active transportation, there's far more mobility out there beyond just the cyclists in our community, and we can achieve a much larger greenhouse gas emission savings. I come from the Ministry of Health by background. I worked there for 12 years and was asked to come here to transportation to lead this initiative. So the health system cost savings and the benefits of physical activity are truly important to me. Obviously, the personal benefit one achieves in terms of their health and well-being, and the community benefits and the social connectivity that it generates are a considerable benefit. We also imagine, well, don't imagine, we know that there are economic opportunities that arise from active transportation through tourism, service, construction, and maintenance. It is the most affordable travel choice. Everyone can make the choice to move by active transportation. There's no purchase required in terms of an automobile or even a bus pass for that matter. And for cities in particular, especially in the urban environments, reduction in traffic congestion is a major issue, and getting commuters in their communities to where they need to go, in areas where they live, work, learn, and play is a major advantage of active transportation. I'll just very quickly acknowledge that we've done a jurisdictional or an environmental scan to look at other jurisdictions, and we know that BC is not out front as a global leader. There are other parts of the world that have bested us in spending and uptake in active transportation, but BC is a leader in Canada, and we want to continue to push that front and emerge as at least following in the footsteps some of those global leaders. And we can do that with enhancing our policies, program investments in active transportation, and that's ultimately what this strategy is intended to do. Here's a quick look at our timeline. As you can see, we're well into at this point. I'll tell you a little bit about the consultation we've been doing. Our target is to land this strategy for June 17th and 18th. The BC Cycling Coalition is hosting an active transportation summit in New Westminster on those days. Our minister, Minister Trevena, is a confirmed keynote speaker on June 17th. She will open the summit, and we hope to have the active transportation strategy in her hands when she does that. So we're pushing quickly. The drafting process is well underway after we've concluded a long series of consultation and public engagements, and the strategy will soon be a public document. On the next slide, just a quick overview of some of the consultation that we've been doing, and I'll share some findings from that process in just a moment. This has been an extensive engagement effort to reach out to all disabilities, genders, ethnicities, socioeconomic backgrounds. We really want to ensure that the strategy is informed by as many perspectives as possible. So in that, we took off into all parts of the province in March. Over a 2-week period, we visited 8 communities to host regional forums. We were in Surrey, Vancouver, Victoria, Courtenay, Ticton, Terrace, Prince George, and Nelson in that time. And we reached out to obviously local elected officials, planners and engineers, Indigenous communities in the area, health advocates and seniors organizations, folks who represent people with disabilities, and we're sure to, and academics. We were sure to receive their input to help inform the strategy. There's also been extensive public engagement process to Engage BC that ran from March 1st to April 15th, where we hosted a website asking 3 questions about what active transportation means to members of the public, what the barriers are to participation, and what the province can do to better enable uptake of active transportation. The Indigenous communities engagement effort is ongoing. We're doing that on multiple fronts. One, working with the Climate Action Secretariat under the Clean BC heading to engage with representative organizations for Indigenous communities, including the BC Assembly of First Nations, Métis Nation BC, and the Association of Aboriginal Friendship Centres. And throughout the course of normal business, the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure, through its regional offices, engages with Indigenous communities around the province. And part of that effort is to understand issues and concerns related to active transportation to help better support Indigenous communities to enable active transportation. We've just completed a circuit of the Local Government Area Association conventions, and there were multiple ones going on around the province in the last several weeks. We were able to share some of what we've heard about active transportation and reflect that back to the elected officials who were in attendance there. And we're doing webinars like this one today. We've got one scheduled with the Planning Institute of BC and working with the consulting engineers on one of theirs as well, as an effort to share information about what we're up to. So all of that consultation is now nearing its conclusion as we head through the drafting process of the strategy. And I thought I'd take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about what we've heard in advance of sharing the final version of that strategy. So we structured the consultation on active transportation around 4 major themes, which were building, encourage and educate, safety, and leadership. You can probably imagine what kinds of actions would fall under each of those things. This was not an attempt to give kind of concrete steel foundation to what the strategy would look like, but rather a way to frame the conversation for the engagement. As part of that consultation process, we found, of course, that folks wanted to say, it's okay, you can advance it. We found that folks wanted to take it into a variety of directions, that they were not going to be confined to those 4 pillars, which suited us just fine. And so you can see in that image there of the post-it notes that there were a lot of points of input, which took us well beyond 4 headings. So I'll just quickly give an overview of some of the things we heard while we were up there. Major themes include obviously an increased dedicated funding for active transportation. That was echoed all over the province. Embracing a cultural shift towards active transportation and reprioritizing corridors and rights of way with pedestrians, cyclists, and active transportation users in mind and as a priority. Improving safety, that was echoed around the province. Safety is a major priority, both perceived and actual safety, and making those enhancements through policy, legislation, and infrastructure. Finally, recognizing the difference in the needs between rural and urban areas was something we heard obviously largely outside Metro Vancouver and Greater Victoria, but it's been reinforced in conversations all over the province that there are unique needs in communities around the province, that we're not all building the same way. We don't all have the same kinds of commutes, and that needs to be acknowledged as part of the structure of the strategy. On the next slide, we talk about leadership, and this is not just intended to be provincial leadership, but this is really more of a coordinating function where we can work with all levels of government to better support active transportation. and including local governments, regional governments, federal government, and large employers and organizations. There were a lot of discussion about the province playing a role in guiding employers to better support employees to make the active transportation travel choice. Again, shifting priorities, like most jurisdictions in North America, BC is very auto-centric, and the theme that we heard was that we need to shift the priorities and move pedestrians, cyclists, and active transportation users closer to the top in the priority setting for how we design policy and infrastructure to support active transportation. On the next slide, the connectivity and integration theme was a strong one in all parts of the province. In the more rural and remote parts of the province, this was about connecting communities where they are, where they have to travel a considerable distance, particularly for Indigenous communities, creating that access to major centers where you find the goods and services you were after, including connectivity to transit service. Those were major themes that emerged for us. And then in the more urban centers, it was about connectivity and network planning, in ensuring and respecting that the network plans that move people around by all modes were integrated, and that it was a provincial right-of-way or a local community right-of-way, paths, trails, bike lanes, sidewalks, that all of those things created linkage so people could move through by all means, including connections to transit and ferries. Community planning was a theme that we heard a lot about. Obviously, when you have local officials, planners, and engineers in the room, you're going to hear a lot about planning. And so one of the areas that emerged as a priority was using encouraging the use of local active transportation plans or transportation master plans, integrating active transportation into official community plans, and establishing at a governance level a local regional active transportation committee to help guide the development of active transportation in a community. Planning standards. So this is one where we can say we've started already. There was a lot of discussion about the province setting some guides around what active transportation design would look like in communities. Feedback we've heard from communities large and small, including in Metro Vancouver, was that they feel that they're out there leading the charge without a lot of guidance around what things ought to look like, and creating some kind of harmony and consistency around design was certainly desired. So the province has started on active transportation design guidelines, working with urban systems and engaging with local governments and planners and engineers all around the province to help inform the strategy. And between you and me, our intent is to release that design guide with the active transportation strategy at the site. And yeah, the last slide is just thank you, but I wanted to wrap by saying we will be releasing the findings from our consultation effort in a What We Heard report that will also be released along with the strategy and the design guide. So you'll get a chance, if you give us the benefit of your input, you'll get a chance to see reflected in the What We Heard report, and you can match that up with the strategy to see where those actions have been identified. So thanks so much for the opportunity to share some information about what we're up to. I really look forward to sharing the strategy with you when it's complete in about a month's time. And yeah, I'm hopeful that we'll have some questions and good discussion about it.
Well, that's just great. Thank you so much, Dean. It's fantastic that you were able to engage with so many British Columbians in this process, and it's just so exciting to be on the verge of the release of this important strategy. So yeah, thanks for all your work on this. I know it's been a bit of a marathon for you.
Yes.
Now
Thank
I'll
you.
just oh yeah. So I just have a little follow-up question. So the Union of BC Municipalities is a member of the Alliance, and so I'm kind of curious around what were some of the common, what was one of the most common things that you heard from local governments about what they need to support active transportation in their communities?
That's a great question. I think you won't be surprised to hear that funding was a major theme. The province currently has a granting program for infrastructure dedicated to cycling infrastructure called Bike BC. And we heard very strongly that there's a desire to open the scope on that granting program so that it would include all forms of active transportation. That is very much the direction that we're headed in. We're working on retooling that program to better support communities. We're also obviously looking to enhance that with additional funding, but that's not something I control directly. That's a Treasury Board item, and we'll be making that request. But certainly this year, the Bike BC funding is up from where it's been in years past, and we're advocating to continue that as we expand the scope for active transportation. The thing that I think was probably a major theme was around the ability of local governments to do effective planning. So making some changes in that regard to better support planning and making some changes to the Motor Vehicle Act better clarify the rules of the road for all mobility users so that it was not just focused on the rules for the automobile.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, yeah, we'll certainly be delighted to see, I mean, with the design guidelines and more infrastructure dollars, that's certainly music to my ears. I have a question here from Eric. He wanted to know, is changing the law to allow wheelchairs and mobility scooters to use bike lanes part of the strategy?
So that's something we've heard a lot about, and in communities around the province, we do see mobility scooters using the bike lane if they're not on the sidewalk, and in some communities make a distinction about what's permitted. It's not something that the Motor Vehicle Act has anything to say about, and so we're certainly keen on having to review the Motor Vehicle Act to include some of those forms of mobility. I can specifically say what will come of that process. That's something that will go through the drafting and review process led by the Ministry of Transportation, but the strategy will certainly be making recommendations to open up that legislation so that we can enhance it and modernize it.
That's great, thank you. I have another question here from Sana. She wants to know if there's also a public transportation strategy. I assume that we're talking about transit there, coming from the ministry that will be alongside the active transportation strategy. For example, a strategy around building commuter trains, etc. The two need to go hand in hand, especially in the Lower Mainland, where people often have to travel longer distances for work, etc.
That is a great question, and certainly one that I would support. I have heard that there are discussions about provincial transit strategy, and I know that TransLink is working on its strategy. So I would say that, you know, from what I understand, yes, that's something that's coming. I don't know what that looks like at this point. It certainly won't be ready in time to accompany active transportation strategy, but I can tell you from the conversations I've had all over this province that that is something that's echoed in all communities, that there's a desire to see plans of that nature.
Great. I have a question here from Erin. She wants to know what kind of ministry staffing levels within any related ministries will be retained or recruited to implement the strategy.
Oh, that's a great question. I know there will be a lot of work involved in implementing the things that come out as part of the strategy. How that comes about in terms of FTEs, I'm not HR, so I won't be involved in making that recommendation, but I think will require resource support to implement. And it's going to take time. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but we do intend to set short, medium, and long-term actions so that we can begin right away and continue this effort so that the strategy continues to be effective in the long term.
Okay, and I have another question and comment here from Katrina. She writes, thanks for the presentation, Dean. Were you able to successfully engage with all segments that you were hoping to reach, or were there some gaps? And if so, how are you planning to reach those that were hard to reach?
Great question. We were fortunate to have great data on our online engagement, where folks told us where they're coming from, what their daily commute looks like. And we were able to achieve a pretty comprehensive view from that public engagement process. Obviously, you always hope to reach more folks as part of the process, but we were thoroughly impressed through the forums and through the online engagement, the amount of uptake we got in those conversations, and even the number of comments that were left. We found that we had over 8,000 site visits on the website, and we had over 1,800 comments left, which was in proportion to some of the larger initiatives that the province has undertaken around poverty reduction and climate action is considerable. We were really pleased to see the amount of response we got in our consultation effort.
Great. I've got time for one more question, and then we have to move on with our other presentations. So I have a question here about whether there's going to be a new way from Sammy, about whether there's going to be a new way to assess the risk of the need for a crosswalk. Currently, it seems that the risk is being assessed as per the number of vehicle crashes or incidents at the site, which would be very retroactive and not being proactive in preventing injuries. So any changes around looking at process for putting in new sidewalks?
Well, that's a great question. I know that's really a community level discussion. Where province would have some influence on that would be the criteria for determining priorities within a community. So we would want to see, as part of our infrastructure grant program, understanding of how this fit within the broader network plan and what priority was given to that particular project. So what that assessment looks like at the community level, I think, may continue to vary according to community needs, but we'd be very interested in understanding how that priority was determined.
Well, that's great. Thanks again, Dean, for that fantastic presentation. There's lots of interest. There's still more questions that we're not able to get to. And unfortunately, due to a previous commitment, we know that Dean needs to leave by 10 o'clock. So if anyone has further questions for Dean, just use the chat box and we'll forward those on to you, Dean, and send those out in an email. Thanks again so much for the presentation and for all the hard work that you've done to make this strategy happen. I'm really excited to see it on June 17th. We'll be there for sure. Now it is my pleasure to introduce Natalie Corbo. Natalie Corbo is the Sustainable Transportation Coordinator at the City of North Vancouver. In this role, she coordinates and develops programming and policy to support the uptake of active and sustainable transportation modes. Natalie has a background in human geography and urban planning and has worked on active transportation in Toronto and Vancouver. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Natalie. We're so pleased to have you speak. And now I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction, and thanks again so much for having me today. I'm really pleased to be able to talk to you about this pilot project that we did. So today I'm going to be talking about the GoCNV pilot project, and basically GoCNV is a neighborhood-based initiative where participants and residents were recruited to try to change their travel behavior to more active and sustainable modes. At the city, we realized that we've done a lot in the past few years to build out our biking and walking networks, and we're also starting to see some new and exciting investments in transit, but we really wanted to also address that missing piece of encouragement to help kind of change norms in the city about how people get around. So this is really the first time that the city has undertaken an initiative like this at the neighborhood scale. So it was our kind of pilot test for some new ideas. And basically our project team supported participants through various incentives, programs, and challenges that were designed to motivate them to drive less and also walk, bike, and take transit more, and generally to help them make more informed travel decisions. So just a quick outline of what I wanted to talk to you about today. a little bit about how we ended up doing a program like this. I wanted to touch on the program goals, fill you in on our implementation, report out on some of the outcomes and results that were exciting, and then finish up with a little bit about lessons learned and let you know about our future plans for GoCNV and programs like this. So on the next slide, just wanted to talk a little bit about TDM and how we ended up doing this project. So GoCNV is a transportation demand management program, really, or TDM program. And for anyone who doesn't know, TDM basically refers to strategies and policies that can affect travel behavior, which can include doing things like incentivizing or even pricing different behaviors. So the goal of TDM is typically to reduce the demand for single occupant vehicle travel. And so often tools would include things like subsidized transit passes, programs like Bike to Work Week, and things, larger scale things like mobility pricing. And TDM tools can be great because they can be, on a smaller scale, strategically implemented and sometimes relatively quickly and with no infrastructure changes, but they can still have a really significant impact on people's travel behavior. And more recently, we've learned a lot from the social sciences about how individualized and social marketing and behavior change principles can be applied to TDM work to make it even more effective. And so we based our program around some of that theory around individualized and social marketing, such as things like getting people to commit to making a change, marketing the benefits of active travel, providing reminders to people to act, using creative communications, and providing some incentives. Next slide, please. So in designing the program, we outlined the goals of GoCNV to be kind of simple, outcomes-oriented goals that were specifically related to travel behavior. And for the pilot, we didn't put specific numbers around them. We just kind of wanted to see where we would get. So basically, we wanted to increase active transportation and transit trips. We included transit there because we recognize that those trips, first of all, it's sustainable travel, and second of all, those transit trips do typically include a component of human-powered transit, and also to reduce motor vehicle trips. And finally, we wanted to develop a replicable strategy and generate some success stories that we could share with the city as a whole, as one of the other goals of our pilot program. And I think that the goals were also sort of influenced by our partner organizations in this project, which was definitely made stronger through local partnerships. And for this program, we had staff from Vancouver Coastal Health and from TransLink actually on our project team, which was great. So on the next slide, we recruited participants in the Central Lonsdale East community of North Vancouver, which has about 4,500 households. And participants were recruited via a direct mail out and also through targeted social media ads. And overall, we had about 250 residents sign up for the program thanks to those recruitment efforts. And about half of those residents formalized their participation by filling out our baseline survey and also taking our summertime Fresh Start pledge. And so to validate our program analysis, we also surveyed residents in a nearby neighborhood who were not asked to participate in GoCNV. And those residents actually acted as a control group for our analysis. Next slide. So as I alluded to when I talked about TDM, branding and marketing were important aspects of this program. And we really wanted to make people feel like active travel was sort of the obvious choice for people. And the program was built off of the concept of this idea of the North Shore lifestyle, which was brought up through one of our early focus groups. And the program used three key messages that were centered around the idea of actually making connections through smarter travel choices. So kind of getting at this idea that transportation is not just about connecting people to their destinations, but also connecting them to important values and aspects of life on the North Shore. And these included a connection with nature, a connection to health, and a connection with people's communities. And this image on the screen is from our campaign materials, and it was specifically designed for this program. So on the next slide, I'll give a brief overview of our program activities, which took place over about 4 months. So first here on commitment, behavior change research has shown that the simple act of getting people to make a commitment will actually increase the likelihood that individuals will change their travel behavior or also other types of behavior. And if the commitments are public, they can also help affect social norms and social diffusion. So basically that idea of sort of wanting to do what your neighbors are doing. And for the pledge, we asked participants to make a summertime fresh start and change 2 driving trips per week to a more active mode. And the pledges were displayed on the GoCNV website, and we heard from participants that it added a feeling of accountability and commitment. Next. In terms of education, we provided a variety of personalized educational resources based on the results of the survey that people filled out when they registered for the program. So we sort of personalized these educational resources to what individuals told us they were looking for. So we offered personalized travel planning help at various events. We also distributed a variety of digital and paper maps, including things like walking, cycling, transit network maps, and also some of our safe routes to school maps. And then we also coordinated a couple different workshops around topics like cycling and healthy living to help people. So next, I'll talk about motivation and feedback. In order to motivate participants, we had them fill out bi-weekly trip passports or travel diaries. And after each one, we would send a feedback email showing their progress and also how they were doing compared to their neighbors. And they received, they were entered in a draw to get a gift card to a local business as an incentive to fill out the trip passport. And we had really positive reactions to the trip passports, and participants said that physically logging the trips really helped them think about how they were getting around the city, which was great. We did have only about 1/3 of the participants actually using the trip passports. So one of the things that we want to think about going forward is just how we can increase participation in those trip passports. So next I'll talk a little bit more about incentives. One of the major incentives for the program was a free Compass card, which also included the fare for a 2-zone return transit trip. And the Compass cards were offered to all of the program participants and their children as well. And in total, we distributed about 200 Compass cards. And this turned out to be a significant incentive for people to sign up for the program and was also an effective motivator for people to try transit again or even for the first time. And next I'll talk about events. So people seemed pretty interested in a wide variety of events when we did that initial survey at the start of the program. So we coordinated a few different events throughout the course of the program. And these included a launch event, which had travel planning help, Compass card pickup, and a bike rodeo. And then we also had GoCNV presence at a few large community events, including block parties. And we organized an urban walk led by some planners and designers along one of our newly built greenways. So that was great as well. And so now I'll move into sharing a little bit with you about our results from the program. In terms of just a brief overview of demographics, the age range did skew towards older adults, as you can see on the graph. In terms of gender split, it was about 65% female. Generally a fairly highly educated group, and we found that over 80% did own a personal vehicle. And next, I'll talk about what we were most successful at. So GoCNV ended up being most successful at promoting more active transportation and transit trips, specifically for recreational travel. And that was found to have a statistically causal effect of the program on participants' self-reported travel behavior. And there was also a reported increase in the use of active transportation and transit for commuting trips, but this was found to be more of a correlation. And in general, people who participated in more aspects of the program reported also completing more active transportation and transit trips, as you might expect. And it's not reflected in these numbers, but I also wanted to note that for commuting mode, GoCNV was a bit less effective at motivating change among motor vehicle drivers. So only about 17% of drivers reported more active transportation and transit commuting trips after participating. Next slide. So the effect on motor vehicle trips was a little bit more challenging to measure for a variety of reasons, but through the trip passports, we measured a 7% decrease in motor vehicle trips that could be related to participation in the program. However, we didn't ask participants about what mode they replaced when they took all of the additional walking, biking, and transit trips that I mentioned. So it's possible that they wouldn't have made those trips at all, or equally possible that they would have driven. And so for this reason, it seems that the program has good potential to affect driving rates, but it wasn't necessarily definitively demonstrated in the pilot. But I think what was demonstrated is that we were able to get people out walking, biking, and taking transit more overall. Whether they would have been otherwise sitting at home or driving their car somewhere, I think it's encouraging that we could promote more physical activity and also start to work towards that cultural shift where people view walking, biking, and transit as being a really normal part of their day. Next slide. And so finally, on that goal of developing a replicable strategy, I think this was really successful for us. So we received a lot of positive comments. You can read a few of them on the screen there. And overall, the strategy had a lot of successful elements and provides a really good template for us to work with for future iterations of the program. And it was really helpful that we were able to parse out the strategies that participants said helped them the most, which I think will allow us to be even more effective with our efforts and with our resources next time. And so I'll talk a little bit now about lessons learned. So some of the biggest strengths, I think, of the campaign as we ran it this time. One, surprisingly, was the mail-based recruitment. We actually only sent out one round of recruitment cards, and so that card you see up on the screen there, that was one side of our recruitment card that we sent out. And the other side had a spot where people could actually fill out their name and address and had a bit more text information. But this is how 50% of participants signed up for the program. And I think that also speaks to the success of the messaging and the graphic design as well. And the card was kind of an unusual size, it was really bright, and it also had a map of people's actual neighborhoods on it, so they knew that it was speaking specifically to them. And the Compass cards we found to be a really great incentive. The cost for us was about $10 per card, and I think that was actually a really good value in terms of what we achieved with those Compass cards. And some of the other incentives were also effective. So we offered gift cards to local businesses, and I think that can also be a great way to get some of those local businesses potentially involved in the program a little more deeply. And finally, the Fresh Start Pledge gave us some great data, and I think served as a really strong reminder for participants about why they were doing it. So yeah, and then on the next slide, I want to talk about just some of the key lessons that we learned. I think one big lesson was around recruitment. So only 3% of the residents that we reached out to actually took the step of filling in the baseline survey. And about half of those participants who signed up did so because they received the card in the mail. And in places that have run similar campaigns, the highest participation rate that we've seen is about up to about 10%. And they've achieved that, I think, by following up repeatedly with residents, which would have required more resources and time than we actually had for this pilot program. But I think that's a really important lesson. And the more resources and energy that you can channel into recruitment, obviously, the more people you're going to touch, which is great. And then I think it's important to really be strategic with how the personalized travel planning is offered. It can be a challenge to dig into that sometimes at events. So being flexible in terms of where you're going and what time you're meeting up with people is really key there. In terms of events and workshops, I think spreading out the events and workshops over the summer, some of them had really great turnout, and some of them had sort of a less clear draw. So I think, especially if you're strapped for resources, that large, exciting launch event is a really great place to focus energy because the Compass card pickup was effective to draw people out to the launch event, and it's really important to take advantage of this event to sort of build some excitement and also get people to meet each other. And in terms of user friendliness, I think the trip passports were a really good tool that improved visibility of the program. But again, just important to think about how people are interacting with technology and with these sorts of tools. So perhaps, using a really good web portal, something that's available for people to use on their smartphones in the future would be great. And I think it's also important to consider more ways to bring friendly competition into the mix and find ways to improve day-to-day excitement about the program through things like neighborhood-based competition. And finally, I just wanted to speak to the value of public visibility of the campaign and how it would be great to get people perhaps to publicly display their participation at their homes or get more local organizations involved in the future. And so finally, just in terms of our future plans, I think we really want to take these lessons learned to inform a larger scale effort. And we're looking to continue this program next year on a larger scale in some really strategic areas that are actually about to receive new transit investments. So we'll really have some kind of exciting things to let people know about and give them a reason to change their travel behavior in some of those communities. So thanks very much, and look forward to any questions and comments.
Great, thank you so much, Natalie. What a fantastic project, and with so much helpful data for other municipalities that might be interested in a similar initiative. I'm curious because I love the motivation piece of this kind of work, and so, can you share with us what did you learn about what are some of the major motivators for active transportation?
Yeah, sure. So we did have a focus group at the beginning to talk about what some of the motivations were for people to be using active transportation, and we did find a lot of the things that sort of you might expect. I mean, there was sometimes an environmental angle, but a lot of it was about feeling physically healthy, and people talked a lot about how it made them feel mentally as well. I mean, it just as we know, active transportation really prepares you for your day, and yeah, it can really make you feel great. And convenience as well, we found is a huge factor for people. And if it's convenient for people to walk, bike, take transit, then that will be the choice over driving. If they're aware of their options and if they're aware of the convenience of it and of how to integrate it really easily into their life.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's great. Now, I'd like to turn it over to our audience to see if there are any questions for Natalie. I have a question here from Aaron, who wants to know what was the timeline and season that the GoCNV pilot took place?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the timeline, we were working on kind of a shortened, like we had to start and wrap up everything within the calendar year. And so the way the timing worked, we ended up really initiating the program activities sort of in June, and we ran the program over the summer. However, we recognized that summer is, sort of a special time for active transportation, and people's travel habits do tend to change over the summer. It's an easier time to make some of those active choices. So we extended the program into September and October as well, which one of the project team members called September the sort of Transportation New Year, which I think is really poignant and speaks to the way that people's travel habits sort of tend to change every year around that time. So yeah, so we had a sampling of summer and that early fall where we were doing the major program activities, and we did the data analysis in late October and November.
That's great. Well, thanks so much, Natalie. I think we'll ask all of our listeners and participants on the line to send any additional questions that you have for Natalie using the online chat or the question box, and we'll have another Q&A session at the end of when Charles is done after his Q&A. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Charles Helm. Dr. Helm has been a family physician in Tumbler Ridge since 1992. He's the author of 9 books on the Tumbler Ridge area and the history of the Northern Rockies, and was a founder of the Tumbler Ridge Museum Foundation in 2002. Charles was instrumental in the proposal that led to the creation of the Tumbler Ridge UNESCO Global Geopark in 2014 and was its first president. He's also the co-founder of the Emperor's Challenge Mountain Run. I want to thank you so much for joining us today, Charles. We're pleased to have you speak on promoting universal access in Tumbler Ridge UNESCO Global Geopark. So now it's over to you.
Oh, thank you so much, and thank you for the opportunity. It's really great to be able to showcase this to an interested audience. Yeah, so the title is Enhancing Universal Access in Tumbler Ridge. If we could just go to the next slide. That's me. I've been here for 27 years, as you explained. Next, please. And yeah, we'll have a little bit to say about this institution, the Tumbler Ridge UNESCO Global Geopark. I'll come on to that in a few slides again. So that's the museum logo at the top left. Top right is our outdoors non-motorized group, which is the Wolverine Nordic and Mountain Society. And over the last 15 to 20 years, our volunteers have built about 30 trails, and we maintain them, total of about 100 kilometers. And these trails lead to a variety of destinations, mountains, rocks, waterfalls, dinosaur tracks, canyons, etc. And this now finds a good vehicle through the Tumbler Ridge UNESCO Global Geopark. Next, please. So people know, I think, what UNESCO stands for, but most people are aware of the UNESCO World Heritage Sites, of which there are quite a number in Canada. UNESCO Biosphere Reserves also have quite a long-standing tradition, and some people don't know that there's now this third arm through UNESCO called the UNESCO Global Geoparks. And this is kind of the new kid on the block, but in Tumbler Ridge, we've been on the cusp of this development, certainly in North America. Next, please. And this just shows you what geoparks do. I mean, it's a combination of conservation, geotourism, and education. There's now a total of 140 of these on the planet, 33 countries. Most of them are in China and the Far East and in Europe. And so there are only 3 in North America and 3 in South America at present. Next, please. So our history goes back here to 2000, when 2 local kids aged 8 and 11 discovered a dinosaur trackway just below town. One of the boys was my son. In the photograph there on the right, he was 8 years old. And this really was a catalyst for the development of lots of good things in Tumbler Ridge and ultimately for the geopark. Next, please. So since then, through our museum, we've had all sorts of innovations for kids, including dinosaur camps for kids, and we conduct tours down to the dinosaur footprint sites, including what we think is a global unique thing of taking people down in the evening or at dusk and using lanterns to illuminate the dinosaur footprints. It's all just lots of good fun stuff, and it's got a local effect, and people around town are very much aware of this and appreciative, but it also creates tourism opportunities. Next, please. And then we've also created this monster almost called the Emperor's Challenge, and this started off in about about 1999, and our coal mines were closing and the community was actually staring extinction in the face. And as volunteers, we just thought, what can we do? We can't control the price of coal, but we can create a mountain run and maybe it'll have some effects. It's now, this year is going to be the 21st Emperor's Challenge. It's become the biggest off-road run in the province. It's so popular, we have to cap the field at 1,000 participants. And we open up for entries 4 months to the day before the event. And it fills up in, I think this year it was even shorter. It was something like 4 or 5 hours this year. The entire 1,000 people had registered, and then everyone else is very upset because they can't get in. We had a problem again this year with websites crashing because it's just people trying to get in so quickly. But it's basically a 20-kilometer run in the mountains, over a mountain summit, a circular route. And you can see on the photographs there, we cater to elite athletes, but also to athletes of all ages, kids. The gentleman bottom right is 83, I think. So it's a real community event, probably the biggest event in Tumbler Ridge now in the summer, and it brings people from all over the Peace region and BC and further afield in Canada and the world, actually. So it's become a monster. We've got a small little committee that puts this on, but we struggle gamely every year to try and create a positive runner experience. Next, please. So this just gives an idea of some of the destinations for the trail system that we've built. Top right is Canusia Falls, bottom left is Windfall Lake, and bottom right is the shipyard area. So you can see quite a variety of trail destinations. Next, please. And this again shows the same mountain summits, snowfields, rock formations, and bottom right is one of our favorite photographs. That's not Photoshopped, that's a genuine photo of how our hikers feel when they get up into our mountains and onto the summits. Next, please. It's all volunteer driven. So we use proceeds from the Emperor's Challenge to enable the trail maintenance. You can see us building boardwalks there, top right, building a little dock on one of the lakes, bottom left, installing signs, bottom right, all with just volunteers. Our community is somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500, but we don't have much trouble getting good work bees from volunteers building these things. Next, please. And more of the same, just we're still focusing on the dinosaurs. We've got a museum with a gallery for dinosaurs now. But the two bottom photographs show how we try and get kids to help us in getting the youth involved is really important. So bottom left, they're building some tent pads at Windfall Lake, and bottom right, they're helping us install interpretive signage on the hiking trails. Next, please. So in doing so, we were very happy with what we've done, but the problem is, if you think of all those slides and those pictures, how do we enable universal access when this is the kind of topography that we are dealing with? And we've just felt bad about it for a long time. You know, we're creating all these opportunities for fit people, but what about folks that have got accessibility challenges? So we developed a project, and our partners in this were the District of Tumbler Ridge, Northern Health, our Wolverine Nordic and Mountain Society, who's our trail building group, our Geopark, and we also work closely with Rec Sites and Trails BC. And so we have a committee called the Building Healthy Communities Committee. Many Northern BC communities have this kind of committee. It's a subcommittee of council of the municipal government. And so we applied for funding. It was supported by the province of BC's physical activity strategy through a Northern Health Active Communities grant. Next, please. And so the first of these projects, we got funded, I think, 13,000, something like that, for a combination of 3 projects. So the first of these was the Bull Moose Marshes, which is a boardwalk project to enable universal access. This is a wetland area suitable for watching birds and so on. It's about 25 kilometers from town, close to a highway. And we built 2 trails there. They're quite short, 250 meters and 650 meters in length. Next, please. Yeah, so as I mentioned, we got just over $13,000. The Bull Moose Marshes was the first, the Lost Haven project, the Cabin project is the second, and the third is the Trail Rider. I'll just have a few slides on all 3 of these. And the project was completed in 2018. So this is Bull Moose Marshes now. So at the top left, you can see we built these boardwalks years ago. They'd become a little bit disheveled. They weren't really suitable for universal access because you could actually go off the edge, as you can see. So our project was to enhance and refurbish these boardwalks. Our oldest volunteer was 88 years old, which was just wonderful. At the bottom right, you can see me inserting what we called the last spike there at the end of it. Was a single day. We had, I think, 10 people. Next, please. There you can see us working on the trails, and bottom left, you can see what this looked like at the end with this sort of edge on either side, which will make it a lot safer for wheelchairs and universal access. You can, bottom right, you can see some of our signage there. Next, please. And it's a team of 8. And so we logged over 100 volunteer hours because quite a bit of carpentry was required as well in the beginning. And that's the view site at the end of the one trail, looking onto the wetlands where you can watch birds, etc. Next, please. So the second project last summer was the Lost Haven cabin, which is a ski cabin in winter. It's a nice place to go in summer, or if you're on a mountain bike or if you're hiking. And we thought, wouldn't it be a good idea to enable universal access into this cabin? Next, please. So there you can see our volunteers working on this, essentially just building a ramp. Again, a lot of carpentry had to be done ahead of time, but there we are installing a ramp. So it's now possible for folks with access challenges to get there by various means, including by vehicle if they make an application to do so, but then they can actually enjoy the area around the cabin and get into the cabin. Next, please. So there you can see at the end of the day, there's our ramp. We are ready now for the trail rider to enter the cabin, and the trail rider is part 3, if we can move on to that slide. So for many of you folks know what trail riders are, but in case there are some that don't know, we kind of call it the wilderness wheelchair as well, and it's got a single wheel, and you kind of need a porter, if I can call it that, at the front, and ideally a porter at the back as well. This photograph is just taken outside our visitor center, and you can see that's Tumbler Ridge with our mountains in the background. But essentially, this enables access onto lots and lots of trails. And here you can see the trail rider in use on our trails. The manufacturers are proud of the fact that someone has actually gone up Mount Kilimanjaro on a trail rider. So you can actually, if you've got the right people front and back, you can take people on pretty rough terrain. So just about our entire trail network of 100 kilometers is now accessible to everybody, provided you've got porters. But we're very happy with the way that's rolled out. There was some it took a bit longer to put into practice because of some insurance things and liability and so on, but that's all been sorted out. So the trail rider is now in use in the visitor center, and anyone can apply to come and use it. So we're very happy with all that, but it's actually part of something quite a bit bigger, and we call that the Health and Wellbeing in Geoparks project. And you can see there we've got these circles interconnecting: move well, connect well, eat well, and they all come together into this thing called Live Well. Next, please. Essentially, there are 4 modules, and we incorporate, it's evidence-based evolutionary biology. We tap into First Nations wisdom, and we focus on healthy physical activities. And so the first, we're busy fundraising for this right now, but the first goal is simply to apply this locally. The second is then to export this to the other geoparks, of which there are 2 in Canada, but there are also 10 aspiring geoparks in Canada to get them involved as well. And then phase 3 would actually be to export this to all 140 global geoparks in the world. So we all know the mantra, think global, act local, and we say, well, we're turning that on its head. Think local, act global. That's what we want to try and do here. Next, please. So promoting health and well-being is very important to UNESCO, and they've actually approached us asking us to lead this initiative, and so we are well placed to lead this. The goal is for us to become a model community and destination for healthy living, and we've got that Latin and then an English translation at the bottom: a healthy mind and a healthy body in a healthy community in a healthy world. And that's sort of obviously the ideal to which we strive. Next, please. And we do that through things. That's myself just outside my medical office, and we've created these images on the outside windows of our health center, and there you can see that wonderful 83-year-old on the Emperor's Challenge. So that's the outside of my office. So there are various ways of messaging this, but our entire health center is now being covered on the outside by these images, which just promote physical activity and make people think, well, yeah, I might be sick today, but in the long term, I want to be physically active and I want to be healthy. So lots of ways of doing this kind of thing. Next, please. And that is my final slide, just sort of symbolic. That's one of our rock formations, snowshoeing it in winter. And the idea of being in this for the long haul, trying to get to the summit and trying not to fall off one side or the other side, but just having the conviction that what one's trying to do potentially can have a global impact. It's kind of almost a humbling thing that here we are in remote rural BC, but we have this opportunity to maybe impact things like active transportation at even a global scale. So thank you again for the opportunity to speak. Obviously happy to take any questions. Thanks again.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you so much, Charles. What an inspiring project, and so exciting to see the accessibility and all of that. I just wanted to ask about, you know, you and your team tackle an important and unique task, and that is creating universal access in rugged terrain. What was the process of working collaboratively, and specifically, how were you able to engage those with disabilities to inform this work?
Yeah, so we actually had visits from experts in universal access working through the geopark. And so we spoke with them about, you know, we've got this idea, now what's actually the best way to try and make it happen. So we try to get input from people with access challenges. And so we even took them, for example, out to Bullmoose Marshes before we enhanced those boardwalks and just asked them, you know, so what are the challenges you see here? So it wasn't just we had an idea and we put it into practice. We tried to get input ahead of time. So that was the one thing. I think the other thing is just, it's a strange thing, you know, when you're living in a big city, sometimes you're just overwhelmed by the size of and the scale of projects. But what I love about being in rural BC in a small place, you can actually, in some ways, it's actually easier just for a small group of committed volunteers to put something into practice. There's, you know, less sort of people looking over your shoulder, if I can put it that way. But, you know, the opportunities are just there to go out and make a difference. You still need to get, you know, approval and permission and funding for things. But somehow, to me, it seems easy. The smaller and the more remote you get, in some ways, these projects, you know, people would think it's counterintuitive, but people would think this might be more challenging because of your isolation problems, etc. But in some ways, we actually find it's easier the more remote you are.
Well, that's encouraging and inspiring, because we know that in some ways it can be. There are definitely challenges in smaller towns. I have a question from Sammy, who says, "This is such an interesting project. Who was part of the Healthy Communities Committee, and were there any other barriers in getting council's buy-in or any other support?"
Yeah, so the Building Healthy Communities Committee it's an official subcommittee of council. So we have a council rep, we have Northern Health reps. I'm on the committee as a family doctor. And then there are about 4 or 5 volunteers, wonderful folks from the community who just believe in this kind of thing. And so they get, you know, approved by council to be on this committee. And, you know, council, we have a liaison through council. Essentially, you know, the things we've taken back to them, you know, it's hard to imagine a mayor and council saying that we don't approve this, because, you know, we're coming up with constructive ideas and we're not actually asking for funding directly from them. We're just asking for approval. And then we, you know, we kind of on the lookout always to see what funding opportunities are available. You know, right now we've applied for an Imagine grant, for example, for another project. So we kind of have to be on the lookout as to where funding might be available. And in this particular case, there was just this opportunity through this funding, which we thought, wow, let's think about it and let's see what the best we can do. And we were just delighted when the funding was approved. And then, you know, it just took a few days really to get the work done, and the trail rider took a bit longer because they had to get it here and then to get the insurance. But as I say, it's up and running now. So it was remarkably barrier-free to answer the question.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's hard to say no to that, right? Especially when all the work is being done for you. I have another comment here from Sharito. It says, thank you so much, Charles, for the wonderful presentation and example of inclusivity and equal access in practice. Absolutely inspiring. I want to move to Tumbler Ridge. Can you tell us more about how Indigenous worldviews were incorporated into your approach? Also curious where the other geoparks are in Canada, and if there is one you have in mind to engage with first to duplicate this model.
Right. So the second part of the question first, the other two geoparks in Canada, there is one in New Brunswick called Stonehammer, and there's one in Quebec per se. So those are the other two designated global geoparks. As I mentioned, there are 10 others at the moment who are trying to get that status. It's a process that takes 2, 3, 4 years. So they're at various stages in the process, but they're across Canada. I think not every single province, but certainly some others in BC, some in Newfoundland, really all over the place. So yeah, it was just a real privilege to be able to engage with some First Nations representatives through Treaty 8 Tribal Association is the most prominent local group. And so we, you had to start somewhere. So we developed these modules on evolutionary biology, which is kind of a unique focus, but it fits in with geoparks. And so we developed the modules, and then we ran it by our First Nations friends and colleagues and supporters, and just asked them to critique it. And they came up with very good suggestions. Some things which I would just have thought, well, that's a no-brainer. Let's put it in there. And they, no, well, it's not quite that simple. Let's refine this. And there were other areas where they just said, no, you've left something out here, and which we were able to include. I think I've forgotten the total number of. It was like hundreds and hundreds of volunteer hours from experts in different fields to come up with these modules. But I just found that the scientific focus through evolutionary biology combined with the First Nations wisdom, they're almost a perfect match. They complement each other, and the one does things that the other doesn't. So I'm just really excited about the opportunity to take this forward, and the fact that UNESCO is actually asking us to do it rather than we're trying to push something on them, it augurs well for the success of this.
Absolutely. That's just wonderful, Charles. Well, thank you so much. And I think we'll just, we'll open up the floor to questions for everyone now. So please go ahead and type your questions and comments in the chat box. I've got one for Natalie. It says, great program and presentation. I wonder if people were interested in being part of the program for environmental reasons, and were you able to assess that?
Excuse me. Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, no, that actually isn't something that we got a whole lot of feedback on. I mean, that was sort of something that we touched on a little bit with the messaging in terms of connection to nature, and our recruitment mail out did touch on that a little bit, but yeah, that wasn't something we got a whole lot of feedback about through the survey. So it would definitely be something I think that would be interesting to ask about in the future, and I think it's probably a really good time to be touching on some of that messaging right now too, just with a lot of the work that's going on in terms of climate strategies in other cities and the province for sure. So yeah.
Yeah, interesting to see if some of that climate change messaging is making people want to act. I have another question for you, Natalie. At the heart of the city of North Vancouver is a huge hill that must seem insurmountable for many considering bike trips. How did GoCNV encourage active transportation up Lonsdale, or help participants reconsider this barrier? That question comes from Carrie.
Yeah, sure. So part of the work that we did was around, helping people figure out what some good routes could be and stuff like that. And, we're fortunate that we do have a couple good multi-use trails that kind of help people get around some of those hills. Definitely it's a challenge, and one of the things that we wanted to encourage people to do was to take, even just for short trips, where you're not going necessarily all the way from the Lonsdale Quay up to 25th or 28th or something, but even if they can just take some of those shorter trips that aren't uphill all the way, then that's great. Longer term, one of the things that we're working on right now to help overcome that barrier is we're working on implementing an e-bike share program in the city. So that's something else that will help people, I think, overcome some of those barriers. But yeah, it's a tough one. There's no easy answers, and some of it is also talking to people too about gear for doing some of those things, and what kind of bike you might need to help you get up those hills and those sorts of things. So yeah, I think it's really of a variety of things, including motivation and including reinforcing the fact that it is definitely healthy to be walking up some of those hills.
That's right. All those people in those blue zones where they live to be over 100, some speculate that it has to do with the hills that they're actually going up and down.
Yeah.
But great that you're profiling the e-bikes. I think we're seeing a real explosion of interest and uptake around e-bikes, and so that is really a great way to combine access and mobility in a green and active way. So thanks for that, Natalie. I have another question here for Charles from Lori. It says, you're uniquely positioned not only as a geopark director, but also as a family physician. As someone with a background in medicine, can you speak a bit on the health benefits of physical activity and being in nature?
Oh, I'd love to, yeah. It's actually, I witnessed this when I went to a UNESCO Global Geoparks a conference in England, and they were trying to promote the idea of health in geoparks. And the strange thing was, I was the only family physician there, and the combination of being a family doc and having this interest in geology and geoparks is unusual. And so that's one of the reasons why they're looking to us, because we are uniquely positioned to do this. But we just live in a lovely corner of the world, and all of our family docs here, we try and promote physical activity. The whole thing of the healthy mind and a healthy body in a healthy community, that's central to everything that our medical practice involves here, because all exercise, all physical activity is good, but our position is that if you indulge in these healthy activities surrounded by mountains and forests and lakes, it's even better. So it's the ideal, and it's on our doorstep. I can walk out of my back door here and I'm on the trail in 20 seconds. So again, these are things that, because you're rural and remote, we don't have some of the things which you can in the big city you're used to and you take for granted, but we do have other things which arguably are extremely precious. And for me, being a family physician involves not just treating diseases and sick people. That's very important, obviously, but it's a much bigger thing than that. And as rural family docs, we have this opportunity to try and create healthier lifestyles through physical activity, and it's actually very easy because of our surroundings. I think it's more challenging the more metropolitan things are. I think it's easy here.
Well, that's encouraging. Thank you so much, Dr. Charles. And I'll just say, from my perspective, looking at the chronic disease literature, it's really cool to see the growing body of research around what being out in the outdoors can do in terms of decreasing blood pressure, improving interest in physical activity, and the serotonin levels and increase in feelings of mental wellness as well. So it's it's all the better, as you said, to be active, but to be active outdoors. So thanks so much. I'm sad to say we have to close it off now. So I would like to thank our three presenters, Dean Murdoch, Natalie Corbo, and Charles Helm. Thanks so much for sharing your work, your knowledge, and your insights with us today. And thanks for all of you in the audience for your attention and thoughtfulness and questions. We're so glad you could join us today. We'll be following up with a very short survey. I hope you'll respond, as it helps us to learn from these events what's working and where we can do better. Please follow us on Twitter at BC Healthy Living or under BCAHL on Facebook to stay tuned for more engaging knowledge translation events. Thanks again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your day, and do try and get outside and be active. Thanks. Bye now.